For a long time, it was thought that if you were a wrestler who came from the bingo halls, then you weren't going to make it in the WWE. But over time, this stance would soften, and independent stars would start to break out and make it into the big leagues. But just who are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Daniel Bryan. Yes, there are two people who are widely considered to be the ones responsible for breaking that seal in WWE when it came to the boss-pushing indie darlings, one of whom we'll get to in a moment, and the other of whom is the American Dragon, Bryan Danielson. Of course, back when he was working in WWE, though, he went by the different name of Daniel Bryan. And it was well under this name that he did the impossible, as being only 5'10" in height and not exactly being built like a bodybuilder, he should never have had a hope in hell of rising all the way to the top. Sure, the Washington native was an incredible in-ring performer, but without the look, it felt like he was destined to be a mid-card act at best. But then something happened. Fans fell in love with Bryan so much, by the time 2013 came around, they'd have taken to hijacking shows to show just how much they loved him. Truly, this was the kind of thing which has rarely ever been seen in wrestling, and it led to WWE pushing the American Dragon to beat 3 members of Evolution in one night to win the WWE World Heavyweight Championship at WrestleMania 30, in the process creating an all-timer of a feel-good moment. Honestly, this is one of the all-time great WrestleMania moments. And once it was over, Daniel Bryan was a made man for the rest of his time in WWE, someone who remained right up there at the top of the card all the way up until 2021. So when you think of indie darlings who made it big in WWE, Bryan really should be the first name which comes to mind. Well, either him or our next subject, the man we alluded to a moment ago, the other person considered to be responsible for Vince McMahon changing his stance on independent stars, CM Punk. That's right, while Daniel Bryan would become a superstar in 2013 and 2014, it would be CM Punk who rose to stardom in WWE first, as it was him who became World Heavyweight Champion on a number of occasions during the late 2010s. Still though, with the World Heavyweight title very much being seen as the secondary belt back then, it wasn't a true rise to the top for one of the founding fathers of Ring of Honor. No, that wouldn't come for Phil Brooks until 2011, as it was then that he cut his famous pipe bomb promo on an episode of Raw. Come on now, we all remember this moment. It's one of the most famous segments in wrestling history at this point, and it instantly catapulted Punk all the way up to the top of the card as an anti-authority figure. Someone who fans who were frustrated about the state of the product at the time could get behind. So big of a star would the Second City Saint become here. In fact, by the time the year was over, he'd be starting a WWE title run, which would end up lasting for 434 days, a modern record at the time. Sure, Punk's first WWE run would flame out a couple of years later when he walked out of the company, but prior to this, he was the biggest example of an indie darling making it big in WWE. Honestly, wrestlers who came from the likes of Ring of Honor after this and who found success in WWE have either Phil Brooks or Bryan Danielson to thank, as they're the ones who laid the groundwork for what was to come years later. Hell, this run would make Punk such a big deal in the wrestling industry. When he made his return to the ring 7 years later for AEW, it would be treated like the prodigal son returning home. And when his relationship with that promotion ended, he'd return home to WWE all over again, this time as a babyface once more. Even today in 2025, he remains one of the biggest stars in wrestling. Of course, for someone who started out as a mere indie guy then, that's quite a long way to come. But because he was able to break through that initial glass ceiling in a way that few others have before him, he was able to eventually reach this point. But what of those who came after Daniel Bryan and CM Punk? Those who walked in the footsteps of the pair and also managed to make their way from the indie circuit all the way up to the main event scene of WWE. Well, there are plenty of examples of this, and one of them would be our next subject as it happens, Dean Ambrose. Of course, back before he was in WWE, Dean Ambrose went by the name that he currently goes by now again, Jon Moxley. And it was well under this name that he certainly made an impact on the North American wrestling scene, not as a technical wizard like Bryan Danielson or an anti-authority figure like CM Punk, but as more of a hardcore deathmatch brawler in places like Combat Zone Wrestling. Yes, if you were a fan of Mox back during those days, then you had to be a fan of violence, as this was what he specialized in. So needless to say, there were many who believed that because of that, he'd never be able to succeed in the WWE system. But in the end he did, because after signing on the dotted line with Vince McMahon in 2011, the man now known as Dean Ambrose would eventually make his way up to the main roster as part of The Shield, one of the most dominating stables in WWE history. And this turned him into a true breakout act during the mid to late 2010s. So much of a breakout act would he be, in fact, during the early days of The Shield, it was assumed by many that he'd end up being the bigger singles star once the group inevitably broke up, not Roman Reigns. Sure, that wouldn't happen in the end, but none of that can take away from how great of a run the Lunatic Fringe had while he was a part of that iconic trio. And he also had a great singles run, one which also saw him win the WWE title. But Dean Ambrose wasn't the only member of The Shield who made a big name for themselves despite coming from the indies, as the exact same thing could be said about our next subject too, the one, the only, Seth Rollins. That's right, before he was Seth Rollins, one of the top acts in WWE, Colby Lopez went by the name of Tyler Black on the indie circuit, and it was there where he had a lot of early success, particularly in Ring of Honor, where he became a one-time world champion in 2010. Really, back then, following the exits of the original founding fathers of ROH like Bryan Danielson, CM Punk, Samoa Joe, and Low Ki, it was performers like Black who were helping to carry the promotion. And after his indie run ended, he would sign with WWE and be renamed Seth Rollins, where, during his early days on the developmental roster, he'd become not only an FCW Florida heavyweight champion, but also the first ever NXT world champion. Still though, even if this was the case, there were plenty of concerns about whether or not he'd be able to succeed on the main roster. Even after the Shield were formed, in fact, Seth was always the one who felt like he was closest to flopping in many fans' eyes when compared to Roman Reigns or Dean Ambrose. How ironic then that when the Hounds of Justice eventually split in 2014, it would be Rollins who rose to the top first, with him becoming WWE Champion at WrestleMania 31 after he cashed in his Money in the Bank contract during the main event, stealing the victory right out from under the big dog's nose. And after that, with him now being a made man, he'd only continue to rise higher. Seriously, as things stand today, he's a 6-time world champion, 1-time Royal Rumble winner, 2-time Money in the Bank winner, 3-time WrestleMania main eventer, and the current top heel on Raw. So he's more than held his own against his former Shield brothers when it comes to the accolades he's built up. Quite an achievement for a guy who at one point was considered by some to be just another act on the indie circuit. But we guess that's just what happens when you're good enough. Really, the only question left is what else will Seth be able to do before his time in the ring is over? But what of another current big name in WWE who came out of that late 2000s, early 2010s era of Ring of Honor? That being none other than Kevin Owens. Now, back during the period of his life when he was running hard on ROH, KO went by his real name of Kevin Steen. And it wasn't just Ring of Honor he was killing it in here. No, he was also a top act in other indie promotions like Pro Wrestling Guerrilla and Combat Zone Wrestling. That said, for as great as he was, given his physique, it was assumed that Vince McMahon would never even give him so much as a second look. So when he eventually signed with WWE in 2014 then, many were surprised, and most expected his run there would end in disaster. Sure, he was able to find early success on the NXT brand as their world champion, but that show was being booked by Triple H, so this was a little different. Of course, as we all know now though, once Owens was called up to the main roster soon after this, he would end up succeeding, with him actually going as far as to beat John Cena clean in his first pay-per-view match. And while there would be some rocky moments here and there after this, eventually he'd settle into a role as a strong upper mid-card main event act on both Raw and SmackDown at various points. Hell, in 2016, he'd even win the Universal Championship, with this leading to one of the best storylines of the era playing out between him and Chris Jericho. And that wouldn't be the only big success Kevin Owens would find on the WWE main roster. No, he'd go on to main event WrestleMania on 2 separate occasions, once against his childhood hero Stone Cold Steve Austin in the Rattlesnakes' first match in 19 years. Even today in 2025, while he is currently out with a serious neck injury, should he be able to return to action, there's no doubt he'll be placed right back in amongst that upper echelon of talent on the card. Yes, like with others we've looked at today, this is what happens when you're someone as great as Kevin Owens is, particularly someone as good as he is on the mic, because even if he loses a match here or there, he can always be counted on to build himself back up in fans' eyes with one awesome promo. But let's move on to our next subject, the real-life best friend of KO, who notably came up with him on the indie circuit and who would also later reach superstardom in WWE. Who are we talking about here? Why, Sami Zayn, of course. Come on now, you can't talk about Kevin Owens without also talking about Sami Zayn. After all, they're two sides of the same coin. And that's been the case ever since the latter's days when he was working on the indie circuit for the likes of Ring of Honor, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, Chikara, and Dragon Gate USA. Sure, back then he was largely overshadowed by his mentor, the mysterious El Generico, but after, as one story tells it, Generico passed away while rescuing a bunch of kids from a fire in an orphanage, Sami would take everything he learned from him and use it to get himself a job with WWE in 2013. And what a great run the Quebec native would have during his first few years there, as he pretty much became the heart and soul of the NXT brand during its early days. And Sami would see continued success in the main roster, particularly in the summer of 2022, when Zayn's bit part in the Bloodline saga was upgraded to feature player, with this eventually turning him into the breakout babyface of the entire company. Yes, in late 2022 and early 2023, there was no bigger hero to fans than Sami. And this took many by surprise, as while it was always known that he was talented enough to be in such a position, it was by then assumed that any hopes of this happening were long dead. Even today, in fact, he remains one of the more popular performers on the entire roster, and that's something which doesn't look like it's going to be changing soon. Will he ever get that world title win in the future? That remains to be seen. But if he does, then it'll fully put the capper on him being a success story in WWE who came from the indie circuit. But what about someone who was a darling of a completely different scene, specifically the UK and European one? Well, that's something we find in our next subject, the man who, while he might have first found big-time success in New Japan before making it to WWE, first he had to work his way up through the bingo halls himself. That's right, we're talking about Finn Balor. Yes, being from Ireland, Prince Devitt's early days as a wrestler didn't necessarily allow him to travel across North America. No, instead of doing that, he'd find himself working local scenes around his homeland, as well as in the UK and mainland Europe. And it was while there that he made quite a name for himself, not just his excellent in-ring skills, but also for the pageantry he brought to every show he was on via his cosplaying ring gear. Seriously, just go back and look at some of that footage of him from the late 2000s today if you want to see someone working as, at different points, the Joker, Bane, or even Venom from Spider-Man. As you would expect then, it didn't take long for Devitt's skills to bring him under the purview of New Japan, with him earning a spot in that company's famous dojo in 2006. And from there, it would be a straight line toward not only multiple junior heavyweight title wins, but also the formation of the Bullet Club in 2013, a group originally led by the Irishman. Still, even with all this success, it was far from a given that Fergal Devitt was going to succeed once he signed on the dotted line with WWE in 2014 as, given his size and status as an indie darling, there was every possibility he could end up being a flop. Thankfully then, this didn't happen. Sure, the man who from here on in would go by the name of Finn Balor wouldn't rise as high as some had hoped he might, and he'd never get that proper world title run on the main roster, but he would still achieve a lot in WWE, as aside from pretty much carrying the NXT brand for a while as a multiple-time world champion, he'd also become the first ever Universal Champion and one of the key parts of the Judgment Day, one of the biggest factions in recent years. Could he still rise higher? Sure. Despite now being in his 40s, Balor doesn't appear to be slowing down, so we expect he's still got several years left in him yet, years during which he might get a full go at being the top dog on either a Raw or SmackDown. And Finn Balor isn't the only former Bullet Club leader who ended up making their way over to WWE and thrived. That's right, it's time to talk about AJ Styles. Yes, AJ Styles has been wrestling for so long, he was briefly a part of the WCW roster during its dying days. But after that company went under in 2001, he didn't make the jump over to WWF like so many of his peers did. No, instead he chose to hone his craft on the indie circuit and in the process become one of the best wrestlers of his generation. Where would he do this? Well, initially it would be for companies like Ring of Honor and TNA, with it being in the latter that the Phenomenal One first broke out in a major way. Hell, it was there he would become the ace of their roster for a while and a 5-time champion. And after this, he joined the New Japan roster in 2014, and after becoming the second leader of the Bullet Club, went on to win the IWGP Heavyweight title on 2 separate occasions. Really, this is where talk of Styles being the best in the world fully started gaining momentum, and that meant when he signed with WWE in 2016, it was hoped that his indie darling status wouldn't be held against him, and that instead he'd be allowed to thrive there just as much as he had in other places. Would this happen? Yes, it would. Because after a ropey first couple of months, the Jacksonville native would quickly find his groove in his new home, with him being so good here that Vince McMahon saw he had something special on his hands. And this led to AJ beating John Cena clean during his first summer there, all before then winning the WWE title for the first time. Honestly, things couldn't have gone better here for him if he'd tried. And that might make him the most successful of all indie performers over the last decade when it comes to transitioning away from places like Japan to WWE. Sure, his career may be winding down now, and it's true that his best years are behind him, but because of the success he was able to find during his early run in WWE, the Phenomenal One will no doubt have a role in the WWE for a long time to come, if not as an active wrestler, then at least as either a backstage agent or some kind of on-screen authority figure. One other former TNA star who doesn't seem like they're going to be filling this role in WWE post-retirement though is our next subject, and that's because they now work for AEW. Before he did though, Samoa Joe was proving in WWE that he could succeed. Yes, when it comes to Samoa Joe, during the 2000s you could make a very solid argument that there were several years in this decade that he was the best in-ring performer on planet Earth. What did Joe do to build up such a reputation for himself? Well, in Ring of Honor, a company which he served as a founding father of alongside names like Bryan Danielson, CM Punk, and Low Ki, he helped to legitimize their world title with his truly epic 645-day run on top. Then, of course, there was his run in TNA, where alongside AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels, he became a pillar of that promotion too. Really, come the mid-2010s, the only thing he had left to do was prove himself on a larger stage like WWE. And that was why it would be in 2015 that he'd finally agree to sign on the dotted line with Vince McMahon. Would things go well for him from there? Yes, as Joe would have a great run on NXT, with him becoming a 3-time champion before all was said and done, a record for that particular belt. Sure, the main roster run which eventually followed that wouldn't be quite as strong, with it being mired by injuries, but he did have many great moments, including an awesome Universal title program with Brock Lesnar in 2017. But what about a modern-day example of an indie talent rising to the top of WWE? Well, for that, we need to look at Gunther. Now, like with Finn Balor, Gunther was not someone who first made a name for themselves on the North American indie circuit. No, hailing from Austria, home of Beethoven and the Alps, Walter Hahn would instead have to cut his teeth in local promotions in both the UK and mainland Europe. Luckily for him though, despite this not offering a lot of visibility, the big man was so good that he stood out anyway. Hell, so impressive was Walter in places like the German promotion West Side Extreme Wrestling and Irish promotion OTT that he wouldn't even need to go over to Japan to gain more attention. No, by the time the mid-2010s came around, he'd already be the talk of the town. And that eventually led to him signing on the dotted line with WWE in 2019 to be a part of their NXT UK brand. Why NXT UK and not NXT USA? Well, at this point, Walter had reportedly no desire to move to America. That said, eventually his feelings on this would soften, as come 2022, he'd have made his way all the way up to the SmackDown roster and would have there won the Intercontinental title. And this was also around the time when Triple H was about to take over booking, something which allowed him to go on a record-breaking run as IC champion before then dropping that belt and going on to win the World Heavyweight title on 2 separate occasions. That's right, in the end, being an indie darling helped Gunther to succeed in WWE. But then the same could be said about everyone we've looked at today.